Very quickly, tonight what we're going to do is each of our speakers, Larry first and Adair, will speak for 10 minutes. Then we'll enter a conversation related to a program on secular stagnation that INET has initiated, really at the inspiration of Larry, wanting to take it another level deeper with some very, very serious and dynamic young scholars that our team and he and particularly Gaudy Egertson, Brown University, have put together. Larry, in November of 2013, is the person who really rang the bell at the IMF and gave a speech and resurrected this notion, which was attributed to the thinking of Alvin Hansen and some others much earlier, but applying it to the current context. And I think, given that it's baseball season and it's October, I am reminded that when Larry gave a keynote at our Toronto conference, I referred to him as the Reggie Jackson of economics. He's the guy who stirs the drink. So in the criticisms of social science, I often think that many people were too romantic about unfettered markets, but also many people are too romantic about the capacities of government. When applying that to moderation, I will tend to be less romantic about the value added that I can create and turn things over to our two speakers promptly. Let's start with Larry.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you for your leadership of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which I think is doing a lot to stimulate thought and creativity on some vitally important problems. And I think there is no more enlightened philanthropist in the world today than George Soros, who has done so much in so many areas to open things up. And this stands as yet another one of his very important legacies. And so I salute you, George, and I'm grateful that your support has made it possible for me and so many others to have this opportunity to participate in the programs of the Institute. 3 years ago, when I spoke about secular stagnation, I did it because I realized that the 2008 recession had happened, that the financial crisis, the abnormalities in financial markets, had substantially corrected by 2009, and instead of accelerating as growth caught up, in fact, growth, if anything, decelerated. I thought back and I realized that there was something very odd about the fact that from 2003 to 2007, we had epically easy money, the Bush tax cuts along with the Iraq War, vast erosion of credit standards, and the mother of all housing bubbles, and that all of that taken together didn't overheat the economy. It was only enough to produce adequate growth. And I thought about the fact that while we teach in economics classes that macroeconomics is about a cycle, and that cycle has ups and downs, and they all sort of cancel out, and so macroeconomic policy just affects the volatility of output, that basically Japan at that point had had 20-some bad years of slow growth and relatively low inflation. And that led me to the hypothesis that we had something going on that was producing a chronic shortfall of output. And the natural candidate seemed to be some systemic excess of saving over investment, caused perhaps by inequality that led to increased saving, caused perhaps by technological changes that made capital goods cheap, that created a dynamic where there was less demand for capital. Think of Airbnb and the demand for building hotels. Think of e-commerce and malls. Think of my cell phone and supercomputers. And you can think of many other examples. If you look at a very crude ratio, the ratio of the market value of equity to the book value of all physical capital, if you look at regular companies, traditional companies, General Motors, Walmart, AT&T, companies like that, that ratio's 1, 1.5, 2. If you look at Google, Facebook, Amazon, companies like that, that ratio's in the 20s. That's telling you something about investment. And then what you're supposed to do when you have a theory is look for some evidence that wasn't the basis for your theory to see if it's true. And if there was a chronic excess of saving over investment, there should have been a decline in real interest rates. And sure enough, if you look at index bonds in the United States, or you look at measures of real interest rates almost anywhere, there's a 20 to 30-year trend beginning sometime between 1985 and 1999 towards declining real interest rates. And so the idea that the interest rate couldn't fall low enough to drive investment and saving into equality at full employment seemed a natural interpretation of all of these various facts. It's the essence of science that you're supposed to identify and make predictions, which if falsified would make your theory wrong. What would have made my theory wrong? If growth had substantially accelerated after 2013, that would have been a problem for my view. It decelerated. If inflation had taken off, suggesting that economies were near potential, that would have been a problem for my view. But in fact, inflation expectations collapsed post-2013. If, as was almost universally forecast at that moment, real interest rates had risen, that would have been substantial evidence against my view. But in fact, a quite remarkable thing happened. Interest rates were much lower than everybody expected, and at the same time, nominal GDP was much lower than everyone expected. That suggests that demand was much lower than everyone expected, and that was the essence of the secular stagnation idea. So I feel like it had a reasonable evidentiary support when I suggested it was a possibility in 2013. And I would say on the basis of the fact that the data have all run the same way, one should think of it as a probability today. If it's right, it has very strong implications for traditional economic thinking. It means that the dominant dynamic stochastic general equilibrium inflation targeting paradigm in use in all the world's central banks is missing the essential issue. That paradigm assumes that policy can affect the rate of inflation and it can affect the volatility of output, but it denies the possibility that volatility can, that central bank or macroeconomic policy can affect over time the average level of output. Yet that's what we all care about. That's what stagnation is all about. It suggests that we may be living in a world of very different normal interest rates than we have expected. It suggests that we need to contemplate a category of policy that essentially hasn't been present in the discussion. We're used to contemplating macroeconomic policies to respond to cyclical problems and structural supply policies to address long-run issues. And the suggestion here is that we need to address structural policies in order to that affect demand in order to affect the long-run levels of output. So I think we have a lot more that we need to learn and to understand better. Questions like, what does fiscal sustainability mean exactly in a world of zero interest rates? can economies function well with negative interest rates if that appears to be necessary to equate supply and demand for investment? If interest rates are zero or very close to zero, and so bonds and money are very close substitutes, what are the distinctions between fiscal and monetary policy and between fiscal and monetary finance of budget deficits? What are the implications of policies that ease monetary policy in a world of zero interest rates for exchange rates and for beggar thy neighbor policies? What is the right way to understand major episodes like the 1930s, like what happened in Japan, like the aftermath of the Scandinavian bank failures in 1990, like the deflationary period from early Reconstruction towards the beginning of the Civil War? So there are all kinds of questions here for economics, which I believe are pregnant with implications for what must be the major policy thrusts: finding ways to live with rates that are low enough to drive economies to full employment, and finding ways to raise equilibrium real rates. And that's why I was so pleased when INET was prepared to sponsor a program of research involving a large number of scholars who would look at various aspects of this, and we can come back to it. I have perspectives on all the questions that I just raised and many more, but I'm not sure my perspectives are right. What I am sure is that if the dominant thrust of macroeconomic research is to work within models where policy is all about the volatility of output and not about the level, we will be failing to study almost everything that our fellow citizens care about, and therefore we won't be making the contribution that we could. And of that I am fairly confident, and that's why I think this program of secular stagnation research that you have inaugurated with some help and guidance from Gowdy Egerton and I, Rob, is such a valuable endeavor, and I'm so glad to be here.
We're glad to have you here, and we're glad to have your guidance and control and inspiration in the process. And Adair, you're a central part of this chemistry as well. And as was mentioned by Rob Duggar, you've written the book on debt and the devil. I sometimes worry that you might have to write a sequel called Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. Yep. About the support of deficient aggregate demand. But let's explore your thinking.
So I think the first thing we've got to decide is whether we do face secular stagnation. I mean, it's obvious that we face an environment of disappointing growth, inflation below target, apparent inadequacy of aggregate nominal demand. I mean, one of the interesting things to look at is each generation of the IMF World Economic Outlook, in which they downgrade world economic forecasts again, and in which they're slowly running out of titles for the front page. They've tried subdued demand, they've tried disappointed prospects, they've tried too slow for too long. I mean, somewhere in the IMF, there's a group of guys whose only job is to try and have another word to describe what's going on. But I think until recently, you could have had an argument that this isn't a secular stagnation. And I think that, I think if Ken Rogoff was here, he'd still stick to the argument that this is simply a very, very large debt overhang problem produced by excessive private credit creation and rising private leverage pre-2008. Because when you have a huge explosion of private leverage, you end up in a situation where the debt doesn't really go away. It just shifts around from the private to the public sector, where the total leverage in the global economy, as the latest IMF Fiscal Monitor has shown, keeps on going up. And where, as Richard Koo described in his great book on Japan, which I think we failed to pay attention to at the time, because I think Japan really was the canary in the mine. You enter a situation where monetary policy alone, ultra-low interest rates, just can't stimulate the economy. So there is still an argument that you could say this is just a very big debt overhang problem. But the longer we have this slow growth and sub-target inflation, the more you have to think that there's something secular at work. And the thing that makes me pretty sure that Larry's right in his hypothesis that something secular is at work is to look at the 30-year, not the 10-year trend, but the 30-year trend in real risk-free interest rates. Take UK 10-year yields on real index-linked gilts. Take an average for each 5-year period from 86 to 90, 91 to 95, and then the last 6 of those 5-year periods, and the sequence is 3.8%, 3.6%, 2.5%, 1.9%, 1.2%, minus 0.6%, and the value is now minus 1.5%. When you see a trend like that, you begin to think that there may be something secular in it. There's something pretty strong about that, with a dramatic fall even before the 2008 crisis. So you can't put all of this down to central bank intervention, quantitative easing. So we seem to have entered a world where savings and investment only balance at very low or negative real interest rates. And of course, those very low interest rates in themselves played a role in stimulating the excessive private credit growth, which landed us with the debt overhang. But despite those very low interest rates, we still have low growth and below target inflation. So I think it's vital that we try to work out why is this, what are the implications, are they secular long-term effects, and that's what this program that we've talked about, this INAT research program that Larry and Gauti Eriksson are deeply involved in as well, and our partners in this, will try to address. We need to try and understand what is going on here. I think it's useful to say that within the secular stagnation hypothesis, there are really 2 different sets of arguments, but then you have to think about whether they're linked. One of them is really a supply-side argument. It's the sort of arguments that Robert Gordon is putting forward about whether, for some fundamental supply-side reasons, there is a slowdown in the attainable rate of productivity growth. But the other side, and I think this more closely links to the way that Alvin Hansen originally used the word secular stagnation, is really about an explanation of why we might have chronic deficiency of aggregate nominal demand, which can only be resolved by very low or negative interest rates. So why might that be? Why might we have that chronic problem? Well, logically, the long-term decline in real interest rates must mean that we have faced over the last 30 years either an increase in the ex-ante desired aggregate global savings rate or a decline in the ex-ante desired or intended global investment rate, or a mix of both. And there's a pretty rich set of starting hypotheses out there of why that might have occurred. There is, for instance, a great paper from the Bank of England from December last year, which tries to set out the candidate hypotheses and attempt some initial quantification. So they talk about if you have lower anticipated growth, and this is where there might be a link to the supply side argument, then you'll have lower apparent required investment, so you've got a fall in ex-ante investment. There are demographic effects. I mean, Japan is now investing less in building houses, not surprisingly, because its population is now declining. There is rising inequality, which will tend to produce an increase in the attempted aggregate savings rate if the rich have a higher marginal propensity to save, which most analysis suggests they do. There's whole of these issues about is there a nation savings glut coming out of structural biases to high corporate or household savings rates. And then, to me, a very important part of the hypothesis is falling investment needs across many businesses because the relative cost of plant and machinery capital goods. And let me be clear that when I say plant and machinery there, I count a software system as a machine in exactly the same way that a physical thing is a machine. Those simply seem to cost less. And clearly in this project, we'll want to explore all of these hypotheses further. But Now let's assume that those are the factors of work, that Bank of England taxonomy of the factors is right. One of the interesting questions to ask is, if those are the factors, what is the likelihood that they are automatically going to reverse or cease to apply anytime soon without a policy intervention? And I think the answer is relatively slight. If those are the candidate hypotheses, I can't see how they're magically going to turn around. Indeed, I think it's possible that some of the factors, for instance, the falling relative price of private plant and machinery investment, driven by rapid information and communications technology progress, may actually intensify. Larry referred to looking at the idea of the market to book of companies. One of the ways that I've tried to think about this is to look at the market cap of some of our new high-tech companies and work out how much investment went into them. Now, Facebook has a market cap of 374 billion, and it floated for 170 billion. When it floated, I tried to work out how much investment had gone in the way that economists use the word investment, which is labor devoted not to producing a current good and service, but to building a machine for future use. My best estimate is that Facebook was built with about 5,000 software engineer years. That is 34 million of equity value at IPO per software engineer input to build the machine. As a ratio between the equity value and the investment, that is totally different from the case when Henry Ford built a factory and people had to build steel foundries to produce the machines that went into Henry Ford's factories before he could produce the Model T Ford. I think this is a very fundamental thing happening in our economy. Now, if this is fundamental and it's not going to reverse, we then have to turn to what are we going to do about it? And obviously within this INET research program, we will also be trying to look at what do you do about it. Clearly, we have to see whether there's any way of offsetting some of those fundamental drivers, like rising inequality, and maybe we can talk about how we do that, like the biases in countries like China towards savings, both household and even more so corporate, like some of the demographic features that make people try and save to deal with long retirements rather than increase the retirement age. But I suspect that even if we did all that as best we can, we might still face a problem arising from the changing balance of investment required in a modern economy. I think it is probably the case that that element of investment, which we've called plant and machinery investment, but let me stress again, I count software investment as a machine, that bit which is done purely by the private sector, which is pure business investment, may for a set of inherent reasons just decline as a percent of GDP because of the remarkable feature of information and communications technology, which every 2 years gives us twice as much hardware for the same price, and which has the feature that when we've made one copy of software, the next billion copies don't cost you anything. I think that what is private business investment may inevitably fall. But conversely, I think we have a whole load of investment needs which are fundamentally structures or infrastructures, whether they be renewable energy, wind farms and solar farms and airports, etc., where there isn't necessarily a declining need, but all of those tend to be ones where either they are heavily dependent on specific public policies to create, for instance, long-term policy regimes which are not automatically arising unless you create them, or indeed are most logically and well delivered by the public balance sheet. And though I think, therefore, the balance of where we can expect to get adequate investment from may require a greater and more thoughtful role for the state than has existed in the past. But I think it's also possible that even if we did the optimal amount of that structural investment, infrastructure investment, you might still have an imbalance of attempted savings and attempted investment. There's no automatic mechanism in an economy which, as it were, creates the attempted saving, makes the attempted savings rate balance with the attempted investment rate at what you might think is an optimal result, or certainly not at a result which produces other than a very low interest rate. And so I think we then have to reflect that suppose that was the case, that suppose despite extra infrastructure investment and action on inequality, we still had an environment where the economy balanced at a very, very low or indeed negative real interest rate. Then I would be in exactly the same place that Larry ended up with, which we then have some really, really complicated issues to think about what we mean by public debt and what we mean by money. In that environment, surely it would make sense to just run fiscal deficits to keep the economy going. And if people will lend you money for zero, and if you can expect that to last for a long time, and if that can be rolled over, in what sense is that actually a burden at all? The alternative, of course, is to finance it directly with monetary finance and to do what Milton Friedman actually suggested in 1948, which is that every year you should have a small fiscal deficit, which is just completely monetary financed. And of course, what this illustrates is that when you get to these extreme situations, the difference between debt and money gets pretty difficult to distinguish. What is money? Money is a perpetual non-interest-bearing debt. And once you get governments able to issue, as the Swiss government is now able to issue, 60-year money, not only at zero, but at negative, you do really get to some very interesting issues of economic theory which relate to the relationship between what is money and what is debt. And I hope in this project as well, we will get to some of those really quite deep theoretical issues which we need to crack and which are entirely new and we didn't know that we would have to crack 5 years ago when we thought we simply had a debt overhang and we're going to pull out of it.
As I listen to both of you, there seems to be a consensus, to use a driving metaphor, like we're in a ditch and we're going to be here for a while. When I look at the notion of fiscal policy, you and Brad DeLong have written about, Adair referred to it here, there is a sense that in the aftermath of the bank problems and the bailout, the great financial crisis, that there is a cynicism. You can see it, as John Hilsenrath recently reported from Gallup about the decline, though it's rebounding a bit, in the popularity or the confidence in the Federal Reserve. There are a lot of people who say, I want public services, but I don't trust the government to provide them. But as Adair said, Larry, we are in a place where we may need fiscal policy. You've talked with Brad as though fiscal policy in a negative real interest rate environment could be costless and help us get out of this. But how do we both turn the perceptions about the role of government and take actions that alleviate this? And then I'll follow that up with both of you. What are we going to do about life insurance and pensions as we sit in this low interest rate environment? That seems like what you might call a slow default.
I will respond to your question, but I just want to make 4 points and I think Adair and I are in really quite similar places. First, if you take the trend line of real interest rates and you begin it in 2000 or you begin it in 1995 or you begin it in 1990 and you do it for one country or you do it for your best estimate of the world, you track where real interest rates are today. If you take that trend line through 2007, before the crisis, and you simply extrapolate it to this moment. And so the idea that this is some debt overhang caused by the crisis is in many ways implausible. If I confronted you with the time series 3-2-1, and I asked you to guess the next element, you might say 2 because it's the long-term average. You might say 1 because it's a random walk. But 0 would have something kind of natural and compelling about it. And so this 25-year trend to real interest rates, the discussions in the central banking community are about whether it's going to reverse fast or whether it's going to reverse slow or whether maybe it's just going to stay the same. But another view would be that 25-year trends have a way of continuing. And that just underscores the gravity of all of this. Second, Adair rightly distinguished between demand side and supply side secular stagnation, the Gordon stuff versus the stuff he and I were talking about. In roughly lecture 2, in introductory economics, most of the time, you kind of get told about the demand curve and the supply curve. And then you get some version of the following bit of reasoning. Suppose the quantity of apples goes down. That can be for one of two reasons. It can either be because the supply of apples went down, or it can be because the demand for apples went down. How do you tell? Well, if the price of apples went down, it's probably demand. And if the quantity of apples went down, and if the price of apples went up, it's probably supply. What is overwhelmingly clear is that the reductions in growth that we have seen have come with reductions in inflation, not with increases in inflation. We had the movie about reductions in productivity growth as the dominant cause. It was called the 1970s, and inflation accelerated just as that theory would predict. And that's why I'm inclined to believe that this is, to important extents, a demand phenomenon. That's reinforced by the observation of what I like to call inverse Say's law. Lack of demand creates its own lack of supply. This is what economists call hysteresis effects. Basically, when the economy is very soft, investment doesn't take place, people don't take risks, people drop out of the labor force and become habituated to not working, and so forth. And all of that reduces the subsequent level of potential output. So I think there's a strong case for believing that all of this is demand-based. Third observation, because I think in this respect, Adair and I have, I've come to think, been slightly incomplete in our exposition. We have, in talking about why real interest rates have declined, we have emphasized a set of what I think are quite important factors. I kind of think they're probably the dominant explanations, basically having to do with the propensity to save and the propensity to invest and what equates them. There are at least two other ways of thinking about the determination of the interest rate that fit into all of this. One is the interest rate also has something to do with the risk premium between safe assets and other assets. And if risk aversion goes up, one would expect to see safe interest rates go down as there was a flight to quality, and risk premiums on other assets, like equities, go up. I think there is a case to be made that some part of what we have seen involves that kind of increased risk aversion. I think there is another effect which raises some troubling policy questions, which I might call interest rate hysteresis. And I would put it this way. Suppose in response to a decline in demand, policymakers lower interest rates to stimulate demand. Some significant part of what happens is they pull forward demand that would otherwise have happened. Interest rates are low, so people buy houses sooner than they otherwise would have. People turn in their cars and refinance their automobile loans. You could give more examples. If you pull forward demand from 2016, the demand that otherwise would have happened in 2016, if you pull it forward into 2014, what happens when you get to 2016? Well, you have an even lower level of demand than you otherwise would have, and therefore there's pressure to have a lower interest rate than you would have needed to have in 2016 if interest rates had not declined in 2014. So this has something in common with George's theories of reflexivity, where the nature of the equilibrium is conditioned by what took place historically. So I think there are a richer set of things to be said about interest rates. But you raised the question, you sort of raised the question of fiscal policy. Look, I believe that the one thing that's unfortunate about the phrase secular stagnation is that it invites a fatalistic view of all of this. Fundamentally, if you step back a ways, supply side problems are really fundamental. Like, we just don't know how to produce more than we did before. Surely in a world of human beings who have egos and avarice, the problem of lack of demand for stuff somehow shouldn't be an inherent and unresolvable problem. And so the diagnosis of secular stagnation is actually a hugely optimistic diagnosis, because it suggests that what we have is a curable malady. From a purely economic point of view, this is kind of illustrated by the experience of the end of the Depression. People thought in 1938 that there were all, 1939, that there were all kinds of inherent limits on the American economy's capacity to produce output and capacity to produce and capacity to employ people that were inherent constraints. Nobody thought that in 1943 because demand was delivered. Now, obviously, that was a necessary kind of demand in the context of that moment, but we would prefer not to arrange an encore. But the crucial point is that what was demonstrated is that secular stagnation is no excuse for fatalism. And that's why I think there's a very broad case for fiscal policy. And I guess I would reach the broader statement of what I think is invited by this idea, which is that there's an enormous amount of productive investment and productive spending to be done in our world, for which there is no traditional business model involving competitive firms that is likely to call forth that spending. And the challenge of addressing secular stagnation is the challenge of finding mechanisms that will call forth that spending and provide that demand. One last thought, if I could. And that is that there is this idea, it's very common in politics, and it's one that one has to address. Is the spending sufficiently productive? Are we being microeconomically efficient? If the government is doing it, will the government screw it up? Will the government do the wrong projects? Will the government be bad at building the roads and all that? And I yield to no one in my enthusiasm for having that be as efficient as possible. I would, however, highlight that, as best I can tell, the contribution of a B-52 bomber to productive output and measured GDP is zero. And that the tremendous investment in what was hugely productive capital, in the sense that it enabled us to win the war, but was not productive capital in the sense of employing workers and producing GDP, was nonetheless highly availing around the world. And therefore, I believe there's a compelling case that fiscal expansions, one, would pay for themselves because of the demand benefits. Two, would pay for themselves because of the supply side benefits if they were done well. Three, would pay for themselves because they constitute transformation from one kind of liability, namely deferred maintenance, to another kind of liability that has a much lower cost in a world where you can borrow money at very low cost. And the last point I'll make is that I think that all of this is going to lead, and this is where I'm not sure whether I'm in the same place as Adair on helicopter money and all of that. I think we're about to have a kind of change in thinking. The idea to date has been dominantly that we want the public to hold money and the public sector to hold the long-term bonds so that we can reduce term premiums and that will stimulate spending. I think we're about to head to a change in the idea that if that's what happens, we don't know what will happen 5 years from now. It may be that interest rates will rise, that some set of things will work, and gosh, if that happens, we're going to have to sell a lot of debt to the public at a high interest rate, and then who knows what will happen from a fiscal point of view. And that actually what we want to arrange is exactly the opposite. What we actually want to do is we know if we sell 50-year bonds at 1%, we know, it doesn't matter what happens to interest rates in the future, that we are going to be fiscally okay. And so I think the correct way to think about helicopter money and extraordinary monetary policies is as devices for enabling the more expansionary fiscal policy, and that the best devices for enabling more expansionary fiscal policies are policies that permit longer-term debt to be sold and absorbed by the public. And I would say in that context that I am not sure that the potential of Mr. Kuroda's commitment to peg the 10-year interest rate at 0 has been fully appreciated. And I believe that mechanisms of that kind, like the Accord in the United States that had the same character during the Second World War, may prove a substantial fiscal policy enabler, and to that extent may be very, very highly desirable.
I think that's a very, very interesting point, and let me give a specific perspective on it, on this issue between debt finance and helicopter money finance. I absolutely agree with Larry that it's incredibly important that we do not accept the out of ammunition story. There's a lot of problems in economics to which there might not be easy solutions. The problems that we had back in the 1970s of stagflation, of simultaneously high unemployment and high inflation were inherently damn difficult to deal with. There weren't easy answers. But if what you have is a deficiency of nominal demand, and that you want a higher inflation rate, you want a higher growth rate of aggregate nominal GDP, it is very important to realize that if anybody says you can't do it because you're out of ammunition, they're wrong. They're definitively, absolutely wrong. Because there will always be a set of policies which are capable of producing an increase in aggregate nominal demand. And it's quite right that Alvin Hansen wrote about this back in 1938. People were worried about it. Along comes the Second World War, and 5 years later, it's absolutely clear that you can expand nominal demand, and there was both a somewhat higher rate of inflation and a higher rate of a GDP. And again, the crucial thing is that we should find a way of doing it which doesn't involve another world war. I mean, we need the imagination to do this without having to go and build a whole load of the modern equivalent of B-52s to deal with it. The only point I've made about helicopter money is it may well be that Larry is right in his article with Brad DeLong that debt finance deficits in this circumstance, with hysteresis effects, with the ability to create growth, and with interest rates at such a low level, will themselves be sufficiently self-financing that why don't you do that? The only point I have made, and of course Ben Bernanke has made this as well, is but there might be circumstances in which that isn't the case. There might be circumstances in which there is a Ricardian equivalent effect. There might be circumstances in which your debt finance, the anticipation of paying it back later would undermine the effectiveness of it. And you simply have to know that if somebody said we were in those circumstances, there is an answer to that as well, that you can go and do monetary finance instead. I think the crucial thing is, actually, what you enter is an environment where you don't know in advance whether what you're doing is monetary finance or not. Because when you do debt-financed fiscal deficits, you may end up, at the end of the day, if you are also doing a quantitative easing operation, you may end up essentially doing a permanent monetary finance. And in that respect, I think Larry's reference to the 1942 to 51 accord is very, very interesting, and it's very interesting to draw the analogies with what Kuroda is now doing in Japan. In 1942, the US Treasury and the Fed essentially said, the US government will issue bonds and the Federal Reserve will buy those bonds in limitless amounts so as to make sure that the interest rate never goes above 2%. And it bought a whole load of these all the way through from 40 to 51, and then it was brought to an end in 51, and there was a deciding to return to the more normal process where that accord wasn't in place. The interesting thing afterwards is, what was the net post facto consequence of this? Well, the quantification is in Friedman and Schwartz, Monetary History of the USA, and essentially they argue, and I think it's a robust analysis, that the America's Second World War effort was paid for about 50% by actual increases in taxes, about 35% by debt, which was truly, in a sense, repaid later, and 15% by what was post facto permanent monetary finance, which was that bit of the increase in the Federal Reserve balance sheet, which once it had occurred, was never reversed. And I think what's interesting is you enter an environment where the debates about, monetary finance and debt finance, you will not know definitively in advance whether you are doing it. But if you go down a thing like the accord route, you will probably find post facto that some of it was monetary finance. And that is what I think is going to happen in Japan. I actually think there are no scenarios whatsoever in which Japanese government debt is ever going to be returned to arbitrary definitions of sustainable levels in the normal sense in which a primary fiscal deficit is turned into a primary fiscal surplus and you pay it down. And I think there are no scenarios whatsoever in which all of the JGBs currently owned by the Bank of Japan are going to be sold to the private sector. So I think there will be de facto, post facto, some monetary finance. But at one level, I thought it important for intellectual clarity to make that argument, to make the argument that you mustn't believe you're out of ammunition because you can do it. But I sort of agree with Larry, we don't actually need to answer these questions in advance. You can simply go out and do the fiscal stimulus. You can do what Kuroda is doing, and I hadn't thought about Larry's analogy, but it's a very good one, that this latest version is very similar to the 42 to 51 accord. And my bet would be that post facto, looking back on it in 20 years' time, we'll say some of it was permanent monetary finance, but actually you may not need to know that in advance for it to be effective.
As I was preparing for this event, I spent a lot of time reading Larry's blog. I've worked closely with Adair. You recently gave the GLS Shackle lecture.
I did. Oh.
And what occurred to me over and over again, particularly when you were talking about the time around the Jackson Hole meeting, is that models aren't working because they're not structurally stable. They're not a particularly good guide. There's an element, you made the comment that the notion of political science in the aftermath of Brexit, Sanders, Trump, and various other things might be an oxymoron. There's no sense of stability of the body politic.
So look, just on that basic principle, anything that calls itself science isn't. Political science, cognitive science, yeah. Christian science, anything that has to call itself science.
That's cover.
Isn't.
It's a mask.
Because physics doesn't say physics science.
Exactly. Precisely.
But in this world where the economic structures, the operation of the central bank, the stability of models, we don't have a lot of guideposts. Is that also a depressing influence on aggregate demand? Does that create what you might call a premium for option value, safe assets, and retard or diminish investment? Do we have hysteresis in expectations related to uncertainty?
Yeah, I'm not sure your average business guy thinking about planting a mall, thinking about building a mall is worrying that much how the economics profession is doing with its models. So in that sense, I think you're reaching a little bit. And you know, if there was a epically high level of everybody changing their minds, we'd be having an extraordinarily high level of market volatility, and that's not something we're seeing. I think there is. I would kind of point to a different sort of loop, what George would call a reflexivity aspect. If people think that macroeconomic policy can't solve the next recession and the next recession will be worse, they will feel poorer. They will therefore spend less, and therefore we will be more likely to have the next recession. And I think that is a feedback loop that I'd probably put a good deal more emphasis on.
Would you add e-commerce as a change of retail and
I think that's an.
influencing the malls?
I think the changes in technology and what they mean for the distribution of income and all of that are a big problem. I think there's a separate mystery in the economy, by the way, which is not really our subject today, but does require thought, which is, it's kind of the thesis of all of us here, and I kind of think it's right, and it's what Alan Murray's Fortune magazine writes about every 48 hours, that we're in this extraordinary epic period of record super duper technical change, and you know, driverless cars and automated checkouts and expert systems doing radiology and computer systems that can that can trade and 1,000 other things are really making technological change at like the fastest rate it's ever been and creating all this uncertainty and destroying all these jobs. It is kind of a puzzle why, if you look at output per person, it's going up slow rather than going up fast, if all that stuff is happening. And so we got a kind of mystery around that stuff that I think is difficult to deal with, and is kind of a separate question than the ones that we're discussing. But yeah, I think that there are all these various loops, and I guess I would say something different about models. I've had a philosophy as a policy, when I've had a policymaker or had to be a decision maker or advise a decision maker, I've evolved a rule. If somebody tells me X will have such and such sized effect on Y, I say, why do you think that? And if they say, because the such and such model says so, I consult a different expert. I require that they be able to explain the rough order of magnitude of their conclusion in some way that I can replicate on the back of an envelope. You know, if we have a tax cut this big, it'll be so much per person. That'll total about $95 billion. That'll total X billion dollars. If people spend half of it, and then the government takes back revenue, that should work out to be about this. And there are these other three small factors that the model calibrates, and so it actually comes out to this number. But if you can't motivate the number to within a factor of 2, simply with an arithmetic calculation that I can follow, I regard the conclusion that it comes from an elaborate computer model with a lot of equations that was estimated with a lot of mathematics as having no persuasive value because I think that you can't judge it for the possibility of garbage in, garbage out. And so it's not that the model's necessarily wrong, it's just in order for it, if the model is right and is producing a reasonable conclusion, you can motivate the conclusion as an approximation with a straightforward calculation. And that's the approach I take to models.
So based on this conversation, you can take those modeling results and file them under either fiction or science, and it doesn't matter.
Something like that.
Yeah. Adair, we haven't really talked about the changes that are taking place in Europe.
All right.
And there's big architectural changes following Brexit. Any of you who follow foreign exchange markets, which I've been addicted to for many years, might have seen the British pound took quite a tumble today. How do you bring what we're talking about related to secular stagnation, slow growth in Europe, more and more uncertainty about the very structure of Europe? Yeah. How do you bring that into focus?
Well, I am very worried about the future of the European economy. And actually, in many ways, I'm far more worried about it than I am about, say, the Japanese economy. It strikes me that Japan has a giant, intellectually interesting, but perhaps at the end of the day, not all that important accounting conundrum. It supposedly has 250% debt to GDP. On a net basis, once you take out what is owned by the Social Security Fund, according to IMF figures, its net debt is about 140% of GDP. But of that 140, 85 out of 140 is now owned by the Bank of Japan. And at the moment, rate they're buying it, there's going to be a date sometime in mid-2021 where there isn't a single government bond which isn't owned by some part of the sort of wider Japanese government sector. All of which is extremely sort of theoretically interesting for those of us odd people who like to think about what is money and what is debt, etc. But actually, Japan is trundling along as one of the richest countries in the world with a sort of 0.5% GDP per capita growth. So they're getting slowly a little bit richer. It has 3% unemployment. It's not a country which seems to have any tendencies to political instability. It is not facing huge flows of migration that it doesn't know what to deal with. I think it's intellectually interesting, but I'm not worried that this thing is about to blow up. And I'm very worried about Europe. I'm very worried about Europe because I think the performance of Europe is still too slow. You have to remember that European GDP per capita is only just getting back to 2007, and in several countries is very significantly below 2007. Unemployment rates in many of the countries are still very high. Yes, they've begun to come down a bit in Spain, but not in Italy, a bit in France, but they're still high. They are still very high levels. So you've got high unemployment in countries which have had very significant inward migration flows, which then has an extra bit that you've got to absorb into the labor market. And I think it has, in the Eurozone, a structure which makes it almost impossibly difficult to arrive at some of the more radical solutions that Larry and I have been talking about, if that is what is required to deal with the situation. Now, you can debate, and if we were debating here with German economists, they would say, look, they would argue it isn't a lack of aggregate demand. I don't agree with them, but they have their points of view. But the crucial point is, if it's a deficiency of aggregate demand, it's incredibly difficult to deal with it within the Eurozone structure. And I think we sometimes just don't realize how very specific the Eurozone structure is and what an incomplete monetary union it is. This is a monetary union without a federal budget, except for the most minute and trivial bit. And to the extent that it does have a federal budget, that is not used in a naturally arising automatic stabilizer fashion that most federal budgets like the US are automatically get used in. And it has in its banking system a form of correlated risk, which is just extraordinary. I mean, if anybody said in America, I've got a grand plan for how I'm going to organize the banking system, and the way that it's going to work is this. A bank which happens to be headquartered in Illinois is going to own, as its undiversified, safe, liquid portfolio, Illinois state bonds. If it gets into trouble, its depositors are going to be looked after by an Illinois state-backed deposit insurance scheme. And if it's really in trouble and you think that it does make sense to bail it out because there's real systemic risk, the Illinois state is going to bail it out. If you said that, people would say, you have gone completely, certifiably mad. You have created a system which has maximized correlated risk. You know, the moment the banks are in problem, the sovereigns are going to be in problem. The moment the sovereigns are in problem, the banks are going to be in problem. And unfortunately, you know, we went ahead with the Eurozone structure without thinking through, you know, what were the logical consequences for a workable system. So I am worried that the Eurozone is struggling with an imperfect set of tools. I think what Mario and the guys at the ECB have is whenever it gets close to spinning out of control, as it did back in 2012 when the Spanish and Italian government bonds were going up, a statement of do whatever it takes and a small amount of bond buying can bring the yields back down and take you away from the sort of mathematics where the debt spins out of control. But the worry is that they have the capability to stop it reaching a crisis in which blows apart, but they don't have the capability alone, and there aren't the mechanisms to create the fiscal coordination for the fiscal side to work. They don't have the mechanisms to make it successful enough in terms of income creation or employment creation to offset the very significant, you know, populist threats. And I would not underestimate how well Marine Le Pen is going to do next year in France. I think people may be really quite shocked by how, I don't think she'll be president, but I think, you know, particularly if she ends up against a left-wing candidate, that's not likely at the moment. I think it'll probably be against Juppé or Sarkozy. But if she was against Hollande, I think she will do shockingly well. I think Hollande will still win, but you know, you will wake up looking at a National Front vote, which will really amaze people. So this is very fragile. Brexit, I personally felt that some of the warnings about how it was going to have a dire and immediate effect were overdone, and there is a sort of credibility problem for the Remain campaign now that there hasn't been a disaster, but I still think it will be negative for the UK economy over time. But I think the bigger concern to me is that, you know, does it just further destabilize Europe by giving, you know, an example of leaving, which others will want to use. My hope was that the response to Brexit, and one of the good things that might have come out of Brexit, was a realization that the Eurozone had to progress to a greater degree of federalization to be successful, that it would be a catalyst for Europe to saying this is what we've got to do to be successful. I fear that that is simply not going to occur. So I think we are in difficult times. Finally, on the UK economy, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, clearly what happened last night was a combination of one of those sort of downward shifts in sentiment, which occurs every now and then multiplied by some algorithmic trading, fat finger sort of, you know, extreme event as well. But there is a big vulnerability on sterling. I mean, this is a country running a large current account deficit, you know, financed by, you know, capital inflows. Of course, when you've got a floating exchange rate, you normally say, well, I'm not worried about that. I'm not trying to manage the exchange rate. So, you know, so what? The capital flows in or out. But if you get a reinforcement downward cycle, I think you could have a downward movement in sterling, which would be really quite destabilizing. The downward movement that we've had so far has, on the whole, been a useful reaction to the Brexit event. I mean, London has been full of tourists this weekend, and please do come and help us. I mean, it's a very cheap place to come now, lovely place, and come and spend your dollars there. But clearly there's a vulnerability that goes further and faster than we want.
We're coming close to the end of the time. Thoughts on Europe? Final thoughts, Larry?
I think I don't live in Europe as Adair does. I think my perspective has changed slightly. It may change again. I speak with much less confidence about this than I did about some of the aspects we spoke about before. I had been inclined to principally see Brexit as a problem, that the British economy was no longer going to be joined in this way with the European Union economy, and that was going to bring with it a set of problems for both, and was going to bring with it a set of problems for the world in interacting with Britain, and to a larger extent in interacting with the European Union. And I still think there's something to that. I think I've come increasingly to see its real significance as more of a canary in a coal mine kind of phenomenon. That I think it is less, there surely were elements of mindless populism in the Brexit vote, but I think there was also, I think it's worth always trying to look for wisdom in things that democratic people, in things that happen in democracies, even when the wisdom seems implausible. And on balance, I obviously, but I certainly would have opposed Brexit. But I think some of what may have been going on was that people in Britain looked, and what they saw was that there was this thing that seemed unable to control its borders in a way that was congenial, that had erected this monetary construction of a Rube Goldberg variety unlike any other the world had ever seen, that seemed to be perpetually in crisis, and that was moving towards a slightly 1984-ish technocratic centralization with very little support from the nationalities involved. And they just said, like, let's hit the ejector seat here. We just want out of this. Like, just whatever the price is, whatever the disruption is, life is just going to be better not on this airplane. And, you know, on balance, I suspect they're going to end up wrong, but I don't think it was a crazy and wildly irrational judgment. And so I think what it forces, in a way, in addition to thinking through the consequences of a separate Britain, it, in a sense, holds up a mirror for all of us to Europe and makes one be more concerned about how long this will happen. Now, you know, you have all this, and you also have the fact that Italy issued I don't know whether it was a 50-year or a 60-year bond, and I don't remember.
2.5.
And I don't remember whether it was at 2.4 or 2.5.
2.48.
I don't remember exactly what but yeah, for a 50-year bond at 2.48. And there's two ways to sort of hear that. Well, you know, a lot of people in the market, and they've thought about it, and they can't be that concerned. Or you could say, why should this be happening? And at some point, people are going to think that's radically mispriced, and the day sentiment changes, there are going to be a lot of things that are very hard. And I don't know with confidence which of those views is right. I do not think, to be perfectly honest, that my friend Wolfgang Schäuble's observation at these meetings that there was a recognition that there was too much demand in the world and that the economies were overheated, and that it would be desirable if the G7 and G20 came to a recognition of that reality and made the appropriate adjustments, that observation coming from Germany's leading power did not encourage me about the immediate prospect of things getting better and policy becoming more enlightened.
So the Institute for New Economic Thinking was founded on our credo is, our job is to foment critical discourse. And I think the two of these gentlemen, with their extraordinary imaginations, experience base, and insights, help us greatly in that regard. But in case there is a cloud of pessimism that hangs over us all based on our conversation tonight, I want to dig out a jewel of optimism, which I happen to find in one former Treasury Secretary's blog. And it goes like this: a critic like me has to remember that the policy explorations of today often become the conventional wisdom of tomorrow. So maybe we're just starting to get on the right track. Thank you both.